Hey guys, it's October and that means my favorite holiday is on deck. I love carving jack-o'-lanterns for Halloween. Sometimes I spend a few hours on a pumpkin. But I hate that all that work eventually just rots or gets thrown out or eaten by squirrels. I mean, it's kind of a waste of food if you think about it. So I started carving those artificial foam pumpkins a few years ago. I like to carve at least one new one every year. Eventually, I'll have a whole jack-o'-lantern army and we'll take over the world! But in the meantime, I'll show you how to carve one of these guys. I'm starting with a little template I drew up, and you can always freehand it, but I like to play it safe. The darker areas are going to be cut out completely, and the lighter gray around the mouth, I'm just going to take the top layer off. Depending on your design, you might want to tape the whole thing on in one piece, but since mine can easily be cut apart and placed individually, I'm going to do that for a better fit. Get things as nice and flat to the pumpkin as you can, and make sure you're using tape that isn't going to peel the top layer of the pumpkin off when you remove it. Now you can use a pin to stab a million little holes all the way around your design. And I like to use a safety pin. And what you're doing is basically transferring the design to the pumpkin. And here's a close-up so you can see some of those little pokey holes. When you finish the hokey pokey and you've turned yourself around, you can remove the template. Now I like to go in with a permanent marker and play connect the dots. Red is nice because any leftover marks at the end blend a little better than black. If you're doing a fairly simple design, you might want to skip this step, but I like to do it just so I don't get confused when I'm carving. The secret to cutting the artificial pumpkins is a dremel. A dremel is kind of like a drill, but it spins a lot faster, so you can actually cut with it. If you're new to the dremel tool, I'd suggest practicing a little first. Grab a cardboard box and go to town on it so you can get a feel for it. The most important thing you want to get a feel for is how to hold the dremel. I started out trying to hold it way up here, but you want to hold it much lower and almost like a pencil. It gives you a lot more control. Another important Dremel tip is safety gear. Carving with a Dremel produces a fine orange pumpkin dust. You don't want to breathe it in or get in your eyes. It's worse than sand. I can tell you from experience. Goggles and a mask are a must. Also bunny ears. You most definitely want to do this outside, if at all possible, even if it means your pumpkins will blow away. The first time I carved one, I did it in my bathroom. Huge mistake. Second time, I did it in the basement. Better, but still a mess. The third time, I finally learned my lesson and did all the carving outside. Much better. The Dremel is going to cut at its own pace, so don't force it. It's less about pushing and pulling and more about guiding it slowly and gently. The way they make these pumpkins is that they cast them in two halves and then glue them together. If you can see the seam on your pumpkin where they glued it together, it's best to avoid carving through that if at all possible. The glue on these things is so much harder than the foam, it can be a little tricky to get through it smoothly with the Dremel. But if you do encounter a glue spot, just be patient and go slow. Also note that I try to keep the Dremel perpendicular to the pumpkin when I'm carving. You'll get a much cleaner cut if you keep the Dremel as straight up and down as possible. You'll also avoid the Dremel ripping out huge chunks of foam unintentionally, which happened the first time I carved one of these guys. Note the aforementioned pumpkin dust. I should also mention that you'll want to wear a crappy pair of clothes because this dust is sticky stuff. For the areas that are just getting the top layer taken off, I actually do like holding the Dremel at more of an angle. I like to think of this part like shading with a pencil. Just lightly brush back and forth with the bit. This tends to be the most time-consuming part of carving, but it adds an extra layer of detail, especially during the day when you can see the whole pumpkin, so I think it's worth it. When I'm finished with the carving, I like to take a can of air and blast all the dust and little carved bits out of there. If you notice that there are little bits of wrinkly paint around your cut edges, I like to take an emery board and sand those off. If you try to rip them off by hand, you can end up peeling big chunks of paint away, and that's no good for business. If you've got a few stray marks left from the permanent marker, you can take most of it off with rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer. That's it. You're ready to become a full-fledged pumpkin master now. Get crazy with it. One of my favorite things to do is to carve a design that goes all the way around the pumpkin. A full 360 degrees of jack-o'-lantern jawsomeness. I hope you have a magically delicious Halloween, and I expect you'll be well on your way to carving your very own pumpkin army this time next year. If you don't want to miss any of my tutorials, make sure you subscribe to my channel. Also, check out whatthecraft.com for more Halloweeny tutorials, plus my original line of sewing patterns.